Hey, it's Jen Vax with YourColorStyle.com, and in this video we're going to talk about contrast when it relates to color analysis. Now you may hear me often talk about contrast. This person has high contrast, you should wear high contrast, medium contrast, low contrast. And what does that mean? What does it mean for you when you're deciding on the clothes and colors that you're going to wear, and how I also use it to determine a person's color type. So we're just going to dive right in. So there are three different ways that you can think about contrast. One is to look at the value of a color, meaning how light or dark a color is. So here is a really good example. We've got a range from white all the way to black. I put numbers on them, so when I use them later on in the slides here, you'll see what I'm doing. And if the furthest away the colors are between in this line here, the higher the contrast. So 0 and 5 are the furthest away on this line and therefore have a high contrast. The closer the colors are together, like a 0 and a 2, the lower the contrast. If you were to put colors into this, the same thing, right? You have a white and black at the very ends. Those are the highest contrast, but a white next to, say, an A would also be a high contrast because there's enough of a gap between the two values. So here is color combinations of high contrast based on value. So as I said, white and black, furthest on the spectrum, if you will, high contrast. And as I had mentioned, 0 and A, a dark color, white and a dark color can also be considered high contrast. These individuals here are considered high contrast, and they wear high contrast colors really well because they have the extreme of this spectrum and the value. So they have the dark hair and eyes and skin, and they have the whites of the eyes. So they have the 0 of the white and the dark of the 5 of the black. Both of them are the same way. The one on the right also has very fair skin, and you might be able to say, well, it may not be a 0, but it could be a 1 and a 5. The skin being the 1 and the 5 being the darkest for the hair. So those are high contrast and by value. Here's medium contrast. Less of a gap between the values. So between 0 and 3, that's a medium contrast. 3 and 5, that's a medium contrast. And so therefore all three together would be a medium contrast pattern of color. And the same with the blues down here. We have a very bright blue next to the white. It's more of a medium contrast. Say the same, relationship here. Less gap between the colors. Now, the contrast between 0 and 5 is very high. So if you were to do a pattern that's considered medium contrast, you'd want an even balance between all three values or just the two. Here is some individuals that I consider medium in contrast. Notice that the contrast isn't as high between their hair, skin, and eyes. It's more medium. There's less of a gap between the extremes of the darkest features and the lightest features. And so therefore they will look best in medium contrast patterns and colors. Low contrast is the least amount of gap between the values. So we have white, 1s and 2s, the lighter colors against the white, but we could also even say the darker colors next to each other as well. It's the low gap between values that makes it makes it a low contrast. So individuals like this would be considered low contrast. They have very little difference between their hair, skin, and eyes. It's not that much of a difference as you tier up in the contrast. And so therefore lower contrast colors are going to look better on them. Oh, and here is the darker colors as well, showing you those low contrasts. Now, this is a really great tip for when you're trying on clothes and something doesn't feel right. It has all the right colors from your color palette, but it doesn't feel right. And it might be because it's creating too much contrast and you may have low contrast, or it's the opposite. You have fairly low contrast. You have very high contrast about you, but the patterns are very low contrast and it's still not doing enough for you. So you got to play with it and see what feels right for you. And this is just one way of looking at colors and patterns to see what might be more suitable for you, more in alignment with you. But contrast isn't just about values. It can also be about the color combination. When we're looking at colors on the color wheel, the further the color is away from the main color of your outfit, the higher contrast the color combination will be. So let me walk you through the basic color combinations and just show you how we go from low contrast color combinations to higher contrast color combinations. So before we talked about value, so even in a monochromatic color combination, if you're wearing all of one shade of color, from a very light red to a very dark red, that would be a monochromatic color combination. It would be a low contrast color combination. However, that only is really true if you're kind of using different shades of the same color. If you're going straight from a very light pink to a very dark maroon, that will still give you a little bit of a higher contrast, even because of the values of those colors. But in general, though, a monochromatic look of all tints and shades of one color is going to be a lower contrast look, okay? Analogous, which is colors that are next to each other on the color wheel, which is a very really interesting look. A lot of people kind of shy away from this type of color combination, but if you can get it right, it feels really good. It's still considered a fairly low low contrast for a color combination, but I would say that we start to kind of tip over into medium at that point, so low to medium. A triad are colors that create a triangle on the color wheel. So if your main color, say, is more of this like light pink, you would then look over into the two other colors that create a triangle on the color wheel, in this case cyan and yellow. And those three colors together create a color combination that could be really interesting. That's also a much higher contrast color combination, has a much more intensity and energy about it. So I'm looking at more of a medium color combination at this point. Split complementary are colors that are opposite the main color on the color wheel, but not directly opposite. So directly opposite would be green from red. So you're going to choose colors that are next to that opposite color. So in this case, you might get some blue greens with the red and maybe some yellow greens with that red, which would be really, really interesting. But this is definitely considered a high contrast color combination. These colors are really, really far from the main color at this point. And so lastly, we have the complementary color combinations, which is the colors that are directly opposite each other on the color wheel and is a high contrast color combination. So if you're someone that really wants more intensity in their wardrobe, you could choose a higher contrast color combination and play with that. You'll also notice that if you are someone that has a low contrast overall, wearing something like a complementary color combination might feel too intense and too much. So again, you just need to play with it and see what feels right for you. So we've talked about contrast with reference to differences in value, how light or dark a color is. We've talked about contrast with regards to the color combinations and how intense or not intense a color combination can be, and that can relate to what works well for you. And then there's also just the contrast to you. So if you are someone that is high contrast, you would also look for colors that not only are high contrast within the fabric or outfit that you're putting on, but also how it could be a high contrast next to your natural coloring. So the woman on the left is a perfect example of this. She has that very dark skin, eyes, and hair, but she needs the high contrast. So putting a color or value that is very, very light up against that dark skin is going to create that high contrast and again, look really, really good. Woman on the right, you could go either way, but since she's so fair, wearing a very dark color will be very striking on her because again, it creates that high contrast against the skin. You can also think of it not just in value, but also in the color combinations we just talked about. Someone who is dominantly has red hair, dominantly kind of warm and orange, is going to look great in the complement, which is blue. This is why redheads often look really great in blue, because it's the complement. It's the color opposite the color wheel. And so you could think of it in relation to you on the colors you might wear. The same with the woman on the right, but in this case, we're looking at more of the value. So she's medium contrast, wearing a medium color next to her lighter skin will create that medium contrast against her. And then for low contrast, we're going to keep everything sort of in the same scope of low contrast. We're not going to want to put a very light color against a dark skin because that's going to create a higher contrast. So these low contrast individuals will stick to, the one on the left will stick more to her light to medium colors to keep it all low contrast, and the woman on the right will keep it to medium to deep colors to keep her in low contrast overall as well. So I hope that helps. This is just one way of looking at color and with relation to you, and when you're picking out patterns, that might help you understand why some things don't feel right and some things do, even if they have the right colors in your color palette. And if you're trying to figure out what colors flatter you best, and most importantly, to learn what colors to avoid that drain you or overpower you, take the quiz out on yourcolorstyle.com/quiz. It's absolutely free, and it'll walk you through step by step on how you can figure out what types of colors are going to make you shine. I'm Jen Vex, and thanks for watching.